St. James. I think it has been shown clearly that this epistle was not written to soften or counter any hard sayings in Paul's letters. The two were aimed at quite different people. Those who read one in the first century were unlikely to read the other, and James's was probably written earlier. But this does not prove there is no great difference between the mind and aims of the two apostles. The difference shows on the surface of their letters, and we grasp it better the deeper we go. The question is whether this difference affects the unity of the New Testament books in their witness to Christ and his church. Is James in his epistle not speaking of a Son of God? Is that not the leading idea he is bringing out? James calls himself a servant of Jesus Christ. The name occurs only 2 or 3 times in the letter, one of its most remarkable features. He writes to the 12 tribes, whatever we say today about lost 10 tribes and restored 2, he recognizes no such distinction. He treats the Jewish nation as a whole, as it was first constituted in Jacob's descendants. But why, you may ask, does this Christian address a nation most of which had rejected Jesus as king? I can only take his words as I find them. He writes to the 12 tribes and confesses himself the servant of Jesus Christ. That is the fact whether I understand it or not. Yet I could not understand him taking any other course. He felt his belief in Jesus Christ was the sign of his being a true Israelite. That belief let him appreciate his own position. He wanted his brethren to understand and appreciate theirs, to feel themselves truly 12 tribes, a united nation, and to know how and why they were so. So far from making them careless of their privileges, he wanted them more alive to them. Do I suppose he was addressing only those not baptized into the holy name, who did not confess Jesus as the Christ? He could not exclude Jewish believers from the 12 tribes even had he wished. They gloried in their national position, and he had taught them to prize it. He could make the best use of their claim to the privileges of the Old Covenant, using it to instruct them in the nature of the New. He evidently assumes those he addresses were passing or likely to pass through great afflictions, which does not limit the letter to converts. Converts often suffered from their countrymen, but no worse than the whole body of Israelites underwent throughout the empire in the quarter century before the city's destruction. James addresses these sufferers in paradoxical language. Count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations. Our translators chose the right word, though often censured for not preferring another. James's meaning is lost if we suppose the trials were not temptations. Those in them would be tempted to distrust God, to think he had deserted them. Precisely because they would be so tempted, their state was good for them. If an enemy was turning their circumstances to ruin their faith, a friend was using them to awaken it. God, ordering all things for them, was not tempting them to evil. Let no one imagine that. He was cultivating their trust and patience. Their own lusts drew them aside, but every good and perfect gift came down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness or shadow of turning. Here begins James's message to the 12 tribes. The God of Abraham, their father's God, is the source of perfect, unmixed good. No evil comes from him. Every circumstance is to be welcomed as his instrument of good. They are yielding to something opposite to him if anything leads them wrong. No lesson was more needed by a Jew of that time. If he believed in Jesus, he needed this truth as the only foundation his belief could rest on. If he did not believe, the truth stood, and to acknowledge it was the first step toward confessing Jesus as the Christ. James continues, "Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." Everything is traced to God's will as the ground of their calling. They had not chosen themselves, he had chosen them. Any Jew who knew his scriptures would recognize this as the source of their covenant and history, and a believing Jew was bound to refer every privilege to it still more thankfully. But what of the next word, he begat us? The idea of paternity enters here. A believer who understood his baptism would say at once, we have not merely a servant's calling but the adoption of children. Yet a reader of Isaiah or Malachi would not stumble at such language. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. Have we not all one Father? how can we claim the I am in whose sight the angels are not pure as our Father? That is the question James would have wished to stir in readers of the prophets, and equally he would have wished church members to feel they had not gained some special privilege for the first time by a new magical operation, but that their highest privilege was to know fully the relation God had gradually revealed to their fathers. James adds that they were begotten by the word of truth. I do not insist this be read as an Alexandrian Jew would by the great passage in Proverbs chapter 8. I do not insist that the word of truth must mean a person. James may not have meant his own language to raise that question directly. The Old Testament had already raised it. The Jews were full of conscious questioning whether the word or wisdom who was with the Lord, whose delights had been with the sons of men, must not be a living bond between men and God, the channel of all spiritual communication. Even in its lowest sense, the phrase meant to every Jew that the unseen God, whom he might picture in no image, had held converse with his mind and heart. Whatever more it means nothing less than that God, by communicating with his creature, had brought him out of natural darkness and the worship of visible things into spiritual guidance. The Israelites' circumcision, his separation from surrounding nations, signified this, and lawgivers and prophets kept explaining it as its intent. It was most needful that the believer in Jesus should not imagine his privilege was different, an outward economy rather than an inward government. James also reminds the Jew that, rightly understood, his privilege made him only a kind of first fruits of God's creatures. The covenant to Abraham could not be fulfilled unless in him and his seed all the families of the earth were blessed. What hint could be more valuable to a converted Jew than that his little sect of Nazarenes was only the first fruits of a vast coming harvest? Here, as I see it, is the great principle of James's epistle, from which all his exhortations and warnings follow. It is a Jewish principle, as I have tried to show, but is it any less an evangelical one? Would James have been a more spiritual teacher had he kept repeating the name Jesus Christ instead of leading his countrymen to study the very nature of his government? Had he taken that course which his modern critics think most apostolical, I think he would have proved his grasp of the gospel was more nominal than real. I do not mean the name Jesus Christ lacks precious significance and reality, or that there were not teachers, some carelessly grouped with James, whose special office was to bring out that name in its fullness, presenting the acts of the man Christ Jesus as objects of faith, uniting his work on earth to his work in heaven. But their task would have been inadequately done without a James to display first and foremost him whose mind the divine word uttered, so that Jews might ask how all their old covenant's prophecies, that God would one day prove himself their Father, could actually be fulfilled. Does the apparent confusion of two classes of Jews, so utterly different in feeling and habit, seem strange to today's reader? I dare say it does, and I do not wonder. But I ask him first to consider whether I am putting this into the letter, or whether its superscription and much of its character do not compel this reading. Next, whether each class did not learn something it much needed through this apparent confusion. Lastly, whether the passages that clearly point to the believer in Jesus are not warnings against evils the church was inheriting from the Jew, evils it was in danger of preserving and passing on, most criminal in the church because they were especially treasons against the man of sorrows. Consider these questions. James says that, since God had begotten them by the word of truth, they should be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, and receive with meekness the engrafted word able to save their souls, but they must be doers, not hearers only. A mere hearer is like a man who sees the form of his creation in a mirror, then goes away and forgets what manner of man he is. All this flows from the truth that a divine Lord and teacher was near, whose voice they were drowning with their own words and passions, who was ready to implant the seed of a new life, after whose image they were formed, and by obeying whose commands they proved their kinship with him and his authority. Every Jew instructed in the law who entered into the Psalms and prophets acknowledged such an invisible government. This prepared them to acknowledge the divine teacher who spoke with human lips, yet directly to the inner mind. And a believer in Jesus could little understand his position if he merely confessed a teacher born at Bethlehem and dead on Calvary, and did not own him as the secret ruler of his heart. Being convinced the believer in Jesus was the true Jew, James practiced all the religious observances his position in Jerusalem allowed. The Acts and the passages in Josephus leave no doubt he was, in the Jewish sense, the most religious man of the city. Yet here he says that if a man seems religious but does not bridle his tongue, his religion is vain, and that pure and undefiled religion before God is to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Believing or unbelieving Jews could scarcely receive a more remarkable testimony from such a source. The unbelieving, tempted always to make devotion consist of observances, were told those observances themselves meant there was an invisible ruler conversing with and governing the heart. The others, inclined to use their descent from Abraham as a reason for separating from Gentile brethren, were led straight to the inward principle and practical result that alone gave their privileges value. Then comes a passage that directly mentions the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. What prompts this apparent departure? This faith, he says, is not to be held with respect of persons. If a man came into their assembly with a gold ring and fine clothes and a poor man in shabby dress, and they honored the well-dressed man, "Sit here in a good place," and told the poor man, "Stand there or sit under my footstool," would they not be partial and judges of evil thoughts? Such things had happened in Christian assemblies and had drawn the notice and contempt of unbelieving onlookers, themselves great worshippers of Mammon, who saw the contradiction at once among the Nazarenes. James admits and proclaims the contradiction for both classes. He grants it is far grosser in those who confess him who was called the carpenter's son, who took the form of a servant, than in anyone else. So he shows by a new argument how Jesus fulfilled the law. Why should believers not treat any poor man as beneath them? Because Christ came to embody and to let them embody the royal law, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." A royal law indeed, the law in the king's own heart, which if they would not obey left them under another law, one that must be kept at every point, a law of slavery, whereas they might obey the law of liberty by which they would be judged if they did not prefer the other. What a fine way of teaching a Jew the meaning of his own Deuteronomy, and how the Christian's sin becomes a lesson on how the Jew needed Christ, that the law might not be destroyed but fulfilled. The famous argument about faith and works follows naturally. What doth it profit though a man say he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him? We think this a Christian temptation. It was emphatically a Jewish one too. James's example makes it clear. Thou believest there is one God, thou thinkest thyself unlike other men, worshipping no idols. Excellent. But the devils also believe and tremble. Faith in a God who tempts us for our good, from whom comes every good gift, who begat us of his own will, that James had put forward as the pillar of life. Trust in a living being who would work in them to do right. But faith merely that there is one God, or that there is a Christ, or that Jesus is the Christ, faith not in a living being but about one, could that save anyone, raise him from sin, make him better? No, like the devils he would believe and tremble, utterly separated from the being he confessed, receiving no energy from him. Abraham believed God, not merely that there is one God, and so offered Isaac, because God worked with him, and by works his faith was made perfect. As the body without breath is dead, needing a quickening influence to move, so faith that does not attach to a living person and receive a vital breath from him is dead. Faith, in James's view, is not itself the quickening principle. That must be what responds to faith, God's power working in the man who trusts him. The next passage on governing the tongue agrees with all this. What an unevangelical subject for an apostle, some Pauline partisan says, with lips or heart. Yes, if the dominion over the inner man, the government of heart and will that James connects with governing the tongue, belongs to mere legal doctrine, then James is essentially legal. But to some, light on this subject seems most spiritual, taking them out of the circle of laws that merely restrain conduct and carrying them to the springs of all divine life. Here especially James sets forth the law of social life, whether in nation or church, under new economy or old. The same unbelief in God's actual government of the inner man, the same bitter envying and strife of heart, was destroying Jerusalem and threatening the Christian community then and in all days. All good things come from above, but the craft that set them plotting against each other was not from above but earthly, sensual, devilish. Yet the other wisdom was given them, though they might pervert it, the wisdom first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. This part ends with the law of peace, kept by obeying the divine spirit of peace. The next opens, "From whence then come wars and fightings among you? Surely from the lusts in your members warring against that spirit of peace. Submission to him is the secret of all quietness, resistance of all discord within and without. All pride, self-glorying, and planning for the future spring from the same unwillingness to submit to the inner ruler, the same unbelief that he is working in us to do right and withstand wrong." The last passage, our 5th chapter, refers directly to a judgment the apostle believed was approaching. The hour was coming when the proud rich man would answer for the laborer's wages he had fraudulently kept back, when his gold and silver would be found cankered, and their rust would witness against the hoarders and eat their flesh like fire. To mammon-worshipping Jews, whether professing faith in Jesus or rejecting him, the words applied equally. James was no respecter of persons. He exempted neither them nor their heathen persecutors, but wished each to take the lesson home, and each could also strengthen himself with "Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord." If they acknowledged Christ come in the flesh, they could not rest until it was shown to all that he was the king. If they had not but still looked for a great king and judge, let them wait, only asking whether any but such a judge as this, one who had cared and suffered for men, could be the deliverer they wanted, or one they could bear to look upon. The patience of Job, of the prophets, of all before them, was recorded for their encouragement. They might be patient as these were, checking restlessness and waiting for deliverance, and they would not be disappointed. Deliverance was coming. But if they were weary, discontented, hopeless, Jews, Christians, why was that? Such, I think, is the tenor of this epistle, which some would have us believe was written to discourage faith and teach conformity to an outward law. It is, I take it, one of the most wonderful exhortations to trust in an inward spiritual teacher, lawgiver, and life-giver. It is the Sermon on the Mount redelivered after the Spirit had descended, who could make men perfect as their Father in heaven is perfect. Had its writer not acknowledged a Son of God and Son of Man who had set up his kingdom among men, his epistle would be a string of incoherent sentences, useless for any moral purpose. That faith turns it into a living whole, one of the most practical discourses any age could meditate on.